Hey, um, so this is a response video to your video series on Gaia, which I really enjoyed, despite any opposition you may have had from the opposing camps. Um, and I say that with jest. Yeah, I really appreciated what you're talking about, and uh, two things, I guess, before I read to you this book called Gaia, A Way of Knowing. Um, well, I like the idea, there's emergent complexity, all that. Earth as an organism, obviously. This sort of thinking is new, so I think there's going to be a lot of opposition to it because there's a lot of well, the camp right now in, I guess you could say, in biology and science is kind of dominated by this um, objectification of nature, and it doesn't really focus on relational processes. Not that it doesn't study them, and not that it hasn't had, a great deal of detail with them, but emergent processes and big picture processes are much more difficult to pin down because they're not, they're not objects, they're process. They're not points themselves, but it's more about the space between the points. So this kind of multiplicative, crazy, nonlinear, it goes into mathematics. This stuff is very complex. So for the benefit of the doubt, what they do is they just say, look, until we have a sound way to measure and look at this stuff, we're not going to believe it. Which is semi-understandable. Science is very conservative, but I just want to give you, not that you need it, but I'm supportive of what you're trying to do and what you're talking about. So at any rate, hold on, I need to find the page. Okay, so this book has a number of authors in it, including James Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, Humberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, and William Irwin Thompson does the intro chapter, and in it he compares a text by E.O. Wilson, who created sociobiology, and he starts off like this. He gives a little quote from the Professor William Buckland lectures on geology at Oxford in the 1800s. And Mr. Buckland says, first, the indications of power, wisdom, and goodness of the divinity would be demonstrated from the evidence of design in his works, and particularly from the happy dispensation of coal, iron, and limestone, by which the omnipotent architect or divine engineer has assured manufacturing primacy to his British creations. So, and then Thompson says, that is Oxford University speaking. That is the best and brightest of their time. I hope in the next century our culture will have grown to the point that the pronouncements of E.O. Wilson at Harvard will appear to be equally ludicrous. And this book was written in 1987, I believe. So it's kind of old, but ironically, it's old in a new way. Like, this is the freshest of the fresh kind of books coming out back in the 80s. At any rate, so then he gives a quote by Wilson as an example of what he hopes to be a thing in the past. And Wilson says, the transition from purely phenomenological to fundamental theory in sociology must await a full neuronal explanation of the human brain. Only when machinery can be torn down on paper at the level of the cell and put together again will the properties of emotion and ethical judgment become clear. And then he's like, notice how Wilson's choice of language, reality, can only be perceived through an act of tearing down machinery to get at the basics. Reductionism is taken for granted as the primary act of understanding, and aggression is seen as the appropriate response to culture of culture to nature. The archaic industrial mentality cannot be more present. Then he gives an example from Maturana. Maturina, I really don't know how to pronounce that. And this is a much longer one, so I just wanted to say, in this example, there's no tearing down, there's none of that. Instead, he's talking about interconnections, not separate anatomical entities, and all right, yeah, okay. So in man-made systems, this conceptual difficulty has not been so apparent because the system of relations, the theory, that integrates the parts that the describer, the observer, defines is provided by him and is specified in his domain of interactions. As a result, where am I? As a consequence, these relations appear so obvious to the observer that he treats them as arising from the observation of the parts and deludes himself, denying that he provides the unformulated theory that embodies the structure of the system which he projects onto them. So basically, our assumptions become part of our observation. So we think we're observing something objectively, but we're really projecting our assumptions and finding them in, if you have a particular attitude about what you're going to find, you may find it in your discoveries. And then he goes on to say, as we can see, Wilson and Maturana are completely reversed images of one another, but contained in these two different biologies are two different ideas of procedure, two different ideas of order, and implicitly two different ideas of political order. Sociobiology denies the ontological value of the individual. All value rests on the gene pool and the relationship of inclusive fitness. The individual is simply a package for the selfish gene. This view of organization of parts to the whole is the worldview of a technocratic society, just as Darwin's perception of the struggle for survival was an expression of the worldview of an industrial society. Sociobiology is a form of apologetics for technocratic management. Since the individual scientist himself cannot contain all the information of science, then science becomes more important than the scientist. In this illusory world, science undergoes an apotheosis that raises it above the individual creative mind of the scientist, and the scientific method is canonized into a sanctified procedure that has very little to do with the actual individual human scientists and the way they make discoveries and invent new theories. The role of unities is thus doubly denied by sociobiology. First, unities are broken down and defined in terms of fragments in the reductionist method, and second, abstractions like species, gene pool, inclusive fitness are reified and not simply seen, this is the part that I really agree with, not simply seen as descriptive procedures of the observer. This world of broken fragments and chemical abstractions is the frightening world of science, capitalist or socialist, a world completely set apart from the organic processes of life in an ecology. The biology of Maturana and Varela, by contrast, begins with the fundamental notion of unities. Varela's Principles of Biological Autonomy, he discusses the failure of conventional biology to recognize the individual as a true ontological unity in evolution. We do not observe a species, we construct the idea of a species in an imaginary historical space. The creation of a species in a biological description is a performance of natural history that is related to cultural history, and I like that part too. Here the individual takes on a new ontological value. And in many ways there is an attractive link between the autopoiesis of Maturana and Varela and the quantum theory of Heisenberg. Both share a more highly sophisticated epistemology. Heisenberg noted that we do not have any such thing as a science of nature. Rather, we have a science of man's knowledge about nature. We do not live in reality, we live in a series of descriptions of reality. In their laboratory work, the organism is much more than a Lockean template bombarded by so many outside meteor-like impressions. So now if we do not have a science of nature, but rather a science of humanity's knowledge about nature, then science is not an external Yahweh-like deity that rules over us in an authoritarian fashion. It is a human activity, so human in fact, that we can more accurately say that natural history is a subset of cultural history, and not the other way around. The concept of unity becomes, therefore, an important perception that nature is made of processes rather than objects, and that these relational processes are always events within a domain of description by an observer. The sociobiologist looks for blah, blah. Okay, so end of this video. I guess I'll make another video.